Today on episode 168 of Author Stories.
And so the thing I've been saying lately, the other part to that, I think why not's a great question. And then the other thing I've been saying to myself lately is, it's not too late.
Hey there, Author Story listeners. This is Kevin Tomlinson from Draft to Digital, and I know that you have a book sitting there just waiting to get out to the world, and you're kind of wondering what the next steps are. So that's why you need to go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories. That's draft2digital.com/authorstories. And that's where you're going to find all the help you need to go from having a book on your hard drive to having it on someone's Kindle or iPad or other reading device. So go visit drafttodigital.com/authorstories right now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Author Stories podcast. You can find all of the archives at hankgarner.com. And when you're there, please click on the links in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show, either on iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher Radio or YouTube. It really does help to boost us in the rankings when you subscribe. And if you would go one better and even leave a review or comment on those platforms, the more engagement we get, the higher it pushes us up in the rankings. The higher we are in the rankings, the more people listen and the better quality guest we can get. So please do that for me, and thank you to those of you that have already done it. I really do appreciate it. Thank you to our wonderful sponsors this week. ThirdScribe.com is there to connect readers and writers in a new and innovative way. Building your author platform, for those of you writers that are out there listening, is the most essential thing you can do for your writing career. Go and listen to the episode I did last week with Rob McClellan. We go very deep into it, but thank you to ThirdScribe.com for sponsoring. Also, thank you to Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. If you are looking for pulpy goodness, do you remember the pulp magazines and comics that we used to read as kids? Do you remember the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits? That's what Tales from the Canyons of the Damned is. This monthly publication that Daniel Arthur Smith pours his heart and soul into is one of the very best things in publishing these days. So click on the link in the show notes and go check out our fine sponsors. Stay tuned after the show for a clip from Richard Gleaves, and visit all of our sponsors in the show notes. I think that you'll find something new that maybe you didn't know of before.
With the oppressive transport authority controlling every aspect of their existence, Leah and her father do what they can to carve out a good life for themselves. Leah spends her nights scavenging and risking capture as she hunts for salvage her father can trade for food and clothing. When Leah takes a bag of salvage from a dying stranger, she and her father are plunged into the world of transport and its war against the terrorist organization, Trace. As transport closes in, Leah will need to decide who she can trust and how far she's prepared to go to save her father's life. The Girl in the City by Philip Harris is the first book in a thrilling dystopian science fiction trilogy set in Michael Bunker's world of Pennsylvania. If you enjoyed books like The Hunger Games and Divergent, you'll love The Girl in the City and its sequels, The Girl in the Wilderness and The Girl in the Machine. All three books are available now on Amazon Kindle. Check the show notes for a link. A thirst for revenge sends one man on a deadly journey through the galaxy in the adrenaline-pumping new novel, Galactic Satori Chronicles. Written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks, this raucous sci-fi adventure introduces Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. In a desire to better understand humans in order to destroy them, these aliens are projecting their consciousness onto unsuspecting men and women, and in the process are learning exactly how to use humanity's own selfishness and greed as weapons against them. Fueled by emotions that the aliens will never understand, Asher bands together with a group of friends. These 4 MIT co-eds are more than meets the eye and go to battle with those who are intent on destroying our planet. Asher takes the fight from Earth to an alien spaceship and back again. A fight that will either save the planet or doom it. The first installment in an upcoming series, Galactic Satori Chronicles, is an engrossing look at the manipulation of time, mental projection, futuristic technology, and of course, aliens. By Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. Pick up Galactic Satori Chronicles now on Amazon. Link in the show notes.
Well, thanks for joining me today for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'm really excited today to have Dan Kinney on the show with me. And welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you, Hank. I appreciate it, bud. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to begin with, I always start off the show by asking the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
No, it's a great question. And so I was a kid who loved to read, but I wasn't one of those, like, we were always going to the library kids. I just don't know why. We didn't go to the library. We were more of I just kind of read whatever was around the house, and then I would read it over and over and over again. So whereas other kids who say they love to read will be like, oh, I read all the Narnia books and Lord of the Rings. I never did. I just kind of read what we had. So we had a lot of comic books from my older brothers who were both, born in the 60s and kind of raised during that huge comic book period. So we had tons of comic books around, and I would read them all the time. And then we had a few other selected books, and I would just read them over and over again. And so I loved reading, and I was pretty good at school, and I liked school, but I never really thought about, man, I wish I could write these stories, because I think to the extent that I thought about it, it seemed a little overwhelming to me. And so I just didn't think about it like that. But, I continued to love books and love going to bookstores all my life throughout high school and college. And I got a master's degree. And so along the way, you end up doing a lot of writing, but it's not fiction. And again, I still didn't really think about fiction. And it really wasn't until I became a dad and I started to tell stories at night to my kids that I started to think about it more. I think, lots of parents tell their kids stories, and kids love stories. And you don't necessarily have to be a great storyteller to have kids like your stories. They just they want to be in it. They want a superpower, and then they're good.
Right.
And so I found myself telling my kids lots of stories. And along the way, I was, shall we say, experimenting with lots of different jobs and careers. And it just so happened that about, 5 years ago, I was sort of at a crossroads. And my wife came to me and she said, you know what, I've stayed home with the kids long enough, and I think maybe it's time for us to switch. And in a lot of ways, she was kind of throwing me a lifeline because I had just gone through a several-year period of kind of monster job stress. And so I took her up on it. And so we switched roles. And so I was a stay-at-home dad for the first time in my life. And again, right about that same time, it just so happened I was telling my kids this epic story, and they loved it. And they loved it in a way that was deeper than anything they'd ever loved before. And at the end of it, one of the kids finally said, hey, Dad, wouldn't it be cool if you could write that down? And then another kid said, Dad, wouldn't it be cool if that could become a real book? And something kind of popped for me. And I thought to myself, why not? Why not? And so that was kind of the moment about 5 years ago when I said, why not? And so I just did what I think anybody in that position does. They just sort of scrambled to the internet, and it's like, wow, what the hell do I do? And not long after that, I found Joe Conrad's blog and and started just trying to read and learn as much as I could. And then I jumped in and started writing. And then, that's kind of how it began.
Some of the greatest things in life begin with, why not? There's, it's such a great attitude to have, and great things usually come out of it.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I think there's that why not, which is something that I've needed here. And then this other thing I've been telling myself lately is, I'm coming up on 42, which is not ancient, but it's old enough that I'm starting to see people in their 20s and they look like they're 10, Like you finally get to an age where people who shouldn't look as young as they do start looking absurdly young, and that's when you realize, oh my God, I'm really starting to get kind of... Now, everything's relative, but the point is, there can come a point at which you start to say, oh, well, that's passed me by, or it's I'm too old to start that. And so the thing I've been saying lately, the other part to that, I think why not's a great question. And then the other thing I've been saying to myself lately is, it's not too late. And whether that means I have another 50 years on this earth or another 1 year on this earth, it's not too late to do the things that you feel like God's called you to do, or things that are fun, or things that you were meant to do, or things that are good. So that's the other part of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's really poignant for me at the moment. My oldest son and I have been having this conversation, for the last couple of days about something that he really wants to do, kind of a passion of his. And I've been encouraging him that, why not do it? If no one else is doing this thing, and it's kind of where this podcast came from, is I was looking for a show, that told a particular story, and I couldn't find that show, so I started it myself. And, so yeah,
I love it. That's great.
There's something freeing about, doing the thing that you want to see.
And it's crazy. I was scrolling through kind of, the archive of your past shows. I listened to a couple of them, but I was kind of trying to prepare, and it's crazy some of the people you've had on this show. It's kind of amazing,
It really is. It really is.
It's amazing enough that I think to myself, well, shit, if he got that person, how many people did he ask that said no? Because that's pretty impressive,
Oh. Well, and most of the people I have had have said no at one point or another. I'm just kind of tenacious, know.
Oh, I love it.
I just don't give up easy. It's kind of a joke, but it's kind of true at the same time. You just learn to not take no for an answer. It may be no for right now, but which is true in writing and publishing. There's a lot of things that we do that we get rejections, or someone doesn't like this or like that. And it may not be for that person, or it may not be for that time, but it doesn't mean that you should give up on that dream. So
for sure. Absolutely.
Do you understand? Yeah.
I sort of had a difficult conversation with a couple of my boys the other day, and I felt bad about it, but I was trying to explain to them, like, you can do two things at one time. Like, you can have realistic expectations about what the odds are and go after your dream. Like I was telling one of my boys who's about to enter high school this next year that, the high school he's going to, the odds of him making a particular sporting team in a particular sport were not good. And It kind of crushed him when I told him. But that was the opposite of what I wanted to accomplish. It took a while to kind of walk that back. But what I was really trying to say was, like, it's good to be realistic. There's a lot of rejection in life. A lot of things are hard. That doesn't mean I don't want you to go after that dream. It just means I need you to know how freaking hard it might be. And that certainly is the deal with writing. Like, there's a reason for years in movies and TV shows, they've made jokes about, like, the daughter bringing home the new guy, and they ask, well, what does he do? And like, he's a writer, It's the age-old joke because nobody makes money writing. And there is a huge kernel of truth to that. Like, it is a really, really difficult thing to do, and yet more and more people all the time are figuring out a way to do it. So it's hard, but there's a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that brings me to kind of the continuing your story there. So you're a stay-at-home dad, because you and your wife decided that was the best thing for your family at the time. Your kids kind of latched onto the story you were telling, and then you found Conrath and some of the self-publishing guys. How do you take that next step from I think I can do this to I'm going to set out a plan and do this?
Great question. So initially, what I started doing once I jumped in and started writing the words down was I started with the story that the kids wanted to hear. And so I just started filling that out. It was the story that became known to me and my kids as Henry Bly and the Gifts of Light. And it really was, its germ was in this classic dads tell kids stories where each kid has a superpower. I mean, I don't know how many times that story has been told, but I'm sure every dad in America has told some version of that story. And so, and so this was kind of our version of it. I just started writing down the words, and I would look at Writer's Digest, and this is not something I had been doing a long time. I was used to writing for jobs I'd had, so I was used to typing and writing and putting words in front of each other, but not fiction. This was brand new for me. And so I just started trying to fill this story out, and I worked for about 6 months, wrote lots of words, like, I don't know, 300,000 words, just trying to figure it out, which is the kind of thing you can do when you get lost in a fantasy. And I'd start over. And finally, one day I was so completely confused that I was at a baseball game watching one of my kids play. It was that first year where they do kids pitch, which is the worst level of baseball you can possibly watch, because they basically are throwing the ball at the bull the entire. I mean, they can't find the strike zone, so it's the worst level of baseball possible. And here I am, I'm zoning out, and I've got a notebook in front of me, and I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to do with this albatross of a story? And I thought, maybe it would be better for me to write something simpler for now, something that is easier for me to do. And so I just started jotting down ideas of something that would make me laugh. And the thing I latched onto was this idea of, what if I was a 12-year-old boy and I was living in a world completely controlled by girls? And that made me laugh. Like, that idea made me laugh. And I just started writing it. And I called it the Beef Jerky Gang, and that book came fairly fast for me. And I think the next step I did when I finally thought, okay, this looks like a book, I knew I needed to share it with somebody. And I had seen online that people recommended, especially to new authors, that maybe getting into a critique group or a writer's group might be helpful. And so, I just started looking online to see if anything like that existed. There was like a writer meetup in Lincoln. I live in Omaha, Nebraska, but there was one in Lincoln. I got there. It just so happened there was a couple other people writing middle grade children's novels who also were looking for a writer's group. We formed a writer's group. We started meeting and sharing work with each other. And I have a lot of particular ideas about the value of writers groups. But I think for the new writer who hasn't shared his work yet or her work yet, I think they can be really invaluable, because I think right at the beginning, you're nervous to share your stuff. You have no idea, to some extent, if it's crap. And you also, there's just stuff I didn't know. And so just in that process early on of sharing my work, and some of the authors and the writers were above me and beyond me, and I learned a lot quickly, and that was really helpful.
Yeah, I've had some mixed experience with writers groups, and I absolutely agree with you that especially early on when you're working on your confidence more than anything else, that's a really great experience. Just the putting yourself out there and learning to deal with criticism, rejection, all that. I think that's absolutely important. Later on, when you kind of find your voice and you understand the story that you want to tell, I think some of that feedback gets less and less valuable. What do you think about that?
100% agree. And in fact, I've seen it myself where I think some people end up spinning their wheels, because the reality is, if nobody had read Harry Potter and I took the finished first draft to a writer's group, every single person in that group would give me definite opinions on how it could be better. And that's the danger of writers groups, because it's just like what end is there? Like, at what point does that end, you know? And I think it ends at the point at which you have enough confidence in yourself, just like you said, to trust your own vision for how to craft stories. Now, occasionally, I didn't understand early on about what it meant to head hop, or some of the subtle differences between third-person close and third-person distance. And I didn't quite understand early on about what people were talking about when they were talking about active as opposed to passive writing. And being involved in the writers group early with stuff like that, nitty-gritty stuff, so helpful.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And some of those things you just, it's hard to get a grasp on until you have someone point it out to you and walk you through fixing those things. And man, I do not want to discount, so please don't anybody think I'm discounting, feedback from people you can learn from and things like that. I'm not. But there just does come a time where you have to, like you said, trust the path that you're on, trust that your vision is your vision.
Right. And see, I think along with that goes with taking that leap, because the point is, you may just not be good enough, right? I mean, that's real. Like, I'm not good enough to play in the NBA. I mean, I could have spent every single moment of my life practicing football, and I spent a lot, but I was only good enough to play college, and not even like super high level college. Now, if I would have eaten better, trained a little bit harder, could I squeezed a little bit more? Yeah, but not that much. Like, there was a ceiling to where my talent could take me. And the same is true in like everything in life. Like, talent's real. And let me give you an example. Lee Child, he's a great performer when he gives talks, and he's great. So I'm just going to have to take what he says at face value. And I remember listening to him talk one time, and he was talking about that very first page of the first Jack Reacher novel, The Killing Floor. And he said, that page, as the reader sees it today, is almost 100% how he wrote it, but for maybe 2-word changes. And it's the very first thing he ever wrote in his life for fiction. Now,
that's nuts.
If that's true, that is insane. That's a level of talent that I simply don't have, and I'm okay admitting that, you know? Like, I don't have that. Like, that's crazy to me. And so then it's possible that you trust your own vision and you're just not good enough, but that's life. You know, that's part of what makes this so fun, is taking swings. But there's this other thing that Lee Child says that I think is awesome. And it was talking about, like, what's the relationship currently between him and his editor. And he started talking about editors and writers groups and stuff like that. And eventually he said, listen, there's a lot of people in this industry who are set up to basically make sure that your book doesn't lose the publisher money, right? So in the process, they tell you, like, well, here's what people are looking for. oh, they don't do that anymore. And along the way, sometimes a lot of the edges that make you get rounded off. And he said, you might have some success doing that, but he said, in his own opinion, the only way you have a chance at like really knocking it out of the park is trusting your own voice and your own vision. And I 100% believe that.
Yeah. I had no preconceived notion to go down this path before we started talking, but I think that was really important for someone to hear today. That maybe it's me, but yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. So that first book that you kind of latched onto, and you told this funny story. Kind of how long did it take you to do it, and then what did you decide to do with it when you were finished?
I honestly can't remember how long it took me to do it, because I quickly started realizing that I had to harness my own adult ADD and start working on multiple projects at one time. What I have figured out for myself is that I do not have writer's block, but I do have project block. And I run into other people who've said similar things online, and that's certainly how I am. So I don't get to a point where I just can't write words. I get to a point where I get stuck in a story. And maybe it's because it's a sign that it's usually a sign that maybe something's not working, or maybe it's a sign that I need to take a long walk, which for me may turn into a long shower, which might turn into another long walk. And sometimes then it's best just for me to just put the project, to the side and just go forward with one of my other projects. So at some point I started working on multiple projects, but at some point I had what I thought was a decent book. And the stuff I read most was the independent blogs, and I read a lot of Newbie's Guide to Publishing blog, and I really wanted to independently publish. Like, that's what I wanted to do. But everybody said, man, in the world of middle grade fiction, that is really hard. And so
I'm so glad you're talking about this, because this is something that's kind of burning in my mind right now.
Right.
So please go ahead.
Yeah, they said it's so hard. You really should try to query it traditionally. And so I found myself sort of half pregnant. I was like, man, I really want to independently publish, because I'm a guy who's kind of impatient / patient. Meaning, with certain things, I'm really impatient, and I just want to I want to move. And then at the same time, I'm okay with if it, it might take me 8 years to really accomplish something, but I sort of feel like if I don't get it started, then it never happens. So that's the impatience part of it. And I wasn't a guy who had a desire to win a Newbery Award. I wasn't a guy who just wanted to have one great book. I wanted to start the process of a lifelong career. Okay? So I thought, independent publishing, that's kind of what I wanted to do. But I heard these people talking about that's so hard. So I ended up querying to about, 20, 23 agents. I may have gotten a couple partial requests, maybe one full. It was, whatever. It wasn't much. And so then that made it easy for me. Now, some people could say, well, there's more agents out there. That's always curious to me when people say that. I actually think there's less agents than people say there are, because when you really look at the number of agencies that actually are like reputable agents of work, say in children's fiction, it's not that long. And most agencies have not all, but most say a no from one of us is a no from all of us. So it really sort of whittles down your pile. So I sort of thought, 22, that's enough. And so that made the decision for me, and I self-published in October of 2014. the beef jerky gang.
Yeah. Dan, let me interrupt you for just a second, because you said that that you're kind of patient/impatient, and you really wanted to self-publish this. I think there's a certain type of person that is just kind of a DIY kind of person. You have that attitude and that kind of spirit, and that certain types of authors would just rather have full control and kind of go through all of the processes of publishing. Do you think you're one of those people?
Yeah.
Kind of someone that just wants to bootstrap it and have your hand in the whole process?
Yeah, for sure. Like there's all sorts of different ways of thinking about this. But I don't really think of myself as a writer so much. I don't, to me, like, there's certain levels of author that are maybe more literary sometimes, and you'll hear them talk about the process, and it's, I sit down with the same cup of tea every morning.
Right.
I sit in my 17th century hand-carved chair. I write meticulously 2 pages of perfect, nothing more, nothing less, and then I walk my dog on the beach, and I think deep thoughts. And
right.
That's awesome. And I think that's a sort of model of writer that some people aspire to. I just don't. I can't even picture myself in the same, like, if that's what a writer is, then I'm not a writer. And what I really think of myself more is a maker. When I think about what's the thing I did when I was little, I made stuff. So, sometimes it's interesting when you get to a certain age to try to kind of tell your story in reverse and look back and say, well, how do I, connect the dots? And for me, I was a kid who I loved making stuff, whether it was in my dad's wood shop or, I was a kid who in high school, I convinced one of the Jesuit priests to give me an extra key to the school. And so at night, sometimes I would go in and I would use their wood shop, and I would just build stuff. And it was right next to the rectory where they lived, and they had this fountain soda tap like 5 feet away from where I was working. So it was just a beautiful setup for me.
Right.
And then in college, I didn't have access to a wood shop, so I taught myself how to carve. And throughout my life, I just like to make stuff, and that's really how I think of books. I love to make books. The parts of it that I can do myself, I like to try to do myself. And it's just fun for me. I think of it the same way I do as like a piece of furniture. I have an idea in my mind of what it might be and look like, and then I try to get as close as I can. And for me, my favorite day is when that first book comes in the mail, and I just kind of see how close did I get. And not just in terms of the look, but that's part of it, but just the whole thing. Yeah. How did it come together? And to me, that's my favorite day. So,
I had a similar experience in school, kind of, where I was not a good student at all. I had dyslexia, and nobody really knew what to do about that. And I was bored at school / drowning, all the time. And I took shop, and this was back in the 80s, where, we still had things like that in school, and it was an important part. I stayed in that shop for 4 years, learning how to tear things apart and see what made them work. And, and God love him, Mr. Kinney, our teacher, who's still a good friend of mine to this day, kind of showed me that there was a different path that you could approach life differently. And, I think I've never really thought of this until you were just talking there. But I kind of think that I approach my writing like I get a big idea and then I tear it apart to see what makes it work. And then, when I write a book, I'm kind of going from that big idea and disassembling it and putting it back together.
It's really cool, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see some people who approach things more from an economics perspective who might say, like there's a certain kind of person out there who they say, man, my time is valuable. It makes more sense for me to hire the guy to fix my car. Now,
yeah,
when it comes to fixing cars, because I didn't grow up around that, that's sort of how I feel, because it's frustrating to me.
Yeah.
But if you were to say the same thing about, like, putting an addition on my house, I would say, oh, no. Yes, I will do it less economically, but, man, it's just fun. And that's how I approach books. Like, I could see somebody say, well, I mean, that cover is going to be better if this person does it. And, yes, it'll cost you money, but, for me, again, if it's something I can do, it's super fun for me to try.
Yeah, absolutely. So you finished that first book. Did you do the cover and the layout and everything yourself?
So with the Beef Jerky Gang, I figured with this one that was not a cover I could even attempt to try based on kind of what I wanted. And so I had to try and find people, and it was I got really lucky because I love the cover. I think it's a beautiful cover. And I looked on one of those sites online. I think at the time it was Elance, and I think now it's called Upwork, trying to find an illustrator. And then I did a Google search and went through different options for a cover designer. And that's kind of how I came up with the cover design, a combination illustrator / cover designer. In terms of the formatting, I had seen a recommendation from somebody, and so I used that. And so I pulled it together. There was elements of it that I decided, now that I've learned, I won't do that again, certainly. And I think that's really part of this journey, is trying to figure out your team. Who do you work well with? What's the right price for your model? And I think largely what I have learned for myself is those people at the beginning who said, man, publishing middle grade fiction is really hard. They were right. It is really hard. Especially those books that are squarely meant for middle to upper middle grade kids, like the Beef Jerky Gang is, and age group being like 10 to 12. That is a really, really difficult age group to target on Amazon. It seems,
and
go ahead.
No. I was going to say, and this is a question I definitely wanted to ask you, and I'll just kind of set it up for the listeners out there. A lot of conventional wisdom from a lot of really smart people says that self-publishing middle grade fiction is really hard because one thing that makes publishing fiction for adults and selling that, I mean, let's get down to the brass tacks, it's about selling the book, is because a lot of people will one-click those things on Amazon when they're, on their Kindle or on the website or on their app or whatever, and middle grade readers don't have the access, most of them don't. They're not browsing for books on there. Those books are being bought by someone for them. So how did you crack that nut, and how did you go about getting to that place?
Yeah, so everything you said is right, and I'm just going to give an example of 3 books I've written. One is the Beef Jerky Gang, one is Katie Plum and the Pendleton Gang, and the other is Teenage Treasure Hunter. All 3 of those books are specifically aimed at the upper middle grade group of kids, which is ages 10 to 12. You can see by the look of their cover, these are professionally done covers. They're slick. They're well done. Blah, blah, blah. Hank, those books don't sell anything. They're really good books.
Yeah, like Teenage Treasure Hunter, the cover looks like it's, out of a Pixar movie or something.
Thank you. It's a great cover, and it's a tremendous book. It's probably my best book. Beef Jerky Gang, probably second. Katie Plum and the Pendleton Gang is maybe a little bit more of a genre fiction thing, like, Fish Out of Water, Girl and Her Horse, maybe plays more like a movie, but it's still really good. And they're well done, they're well edited, there's good illustrations to the extent that they're needed. And subsequently they cost me a lot to produce, and they're my worst selling books. And what I've discovered, and I've talked to a lot of people either that have on Kindle boards or online forums, here's what we think is going on. When it comes, everything you said is right when it comes to middle to upper middle grade books. But there are some exceptions, and the largest exception is in the area of fantasy. Now, a lot of authors out there write fantasy novels for kids, and they never sell at all. But every once in a while, you'll see one break through, and it breaks through because fantasy has a crossover audience. If a fantasy is well done, it'll cross over to adults. And, off the top of my head,
sure, Harry Potter is the prime example of that.
And you can find some independent authors of fantasies for kids who've hit a little bit of that crossover audience. But a lot of these fantasies that are written, and I think fantasy is one of those things where, like, at least every author's got one in them,
Yeah.
And so I think that's...
Or at least we think we do.
At least we think we do, and a lot of people start there, and most of them don't sell. Okay, so what I discovered just by doing a lot of browsing was the authors that seemed to be doing well, who seemed like they were selling a lot of books, were targeting a younger audience. They were targeting more of that middle to lower middle grade, crossing over with chapter books sort of group.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so my speculation as to what is going on is that if you're an adult who is trying to find books online for your 7 or 8 or even 9-year-old kid, you just want something that they're going to read. And once you know that they read it, you're going to get more of that. And especially because you're really trying to prime the pump for reading for them at that age. At some point, and I think it's around age 10 to 11, especially boys, but with all of them, they start to make their own decisions. Unfortunately, those kids don't have the ability to make their own purchasing decisions. So gone are the days where they're just going to read whatever their mom or dad gets them. They want to make their own decisions. They get that information from librarians, teachers, book fairs, and most of all, their friends at school. And they may then direct their parents to go buy them a specific book. But I think that's an area where traditional publishing shines, at distributing to that kid. But for the parent who either has a reluctant reader or a kid who's just at the beginning of their reading journey with chapter books and intermediate readers and then on into short novels, I think that's an area that people can have success online.
Okay. What do you do specifically to make sure that your book gets out there and gets noticed?
I wish I knew. So much of this is an element of good fortune and taking lots of swings. I have this series that I write with Emily Bover, who's a good friend. She's also a stay-at-home parent of 8 children. So we've got that in common, and we write this series called The Math Inspectors, and it does really well. Now, really well compared to a blow-it-out, bestseller traditionally? Of course not. That's not what I mean. But it generates real cash each and every month, and it's really a valuable asset for us. And I think we sort of got lucky. Now, part of that is it's really difficult. Let me go back for a second.
Okay.
Brand, I'm not sure brand is all that important on Amazon sometimes.
Okay.
Like, I was listening to the Chris Fox podcast, and it's fascinating how Amazon works. And I think sometimes in the real world of retail, brand is super powerful. And then we get to a place like Amazon, and sometimes Amazon benefits when you just tell Amazon exactly what something is, you know?
Right.
So that people know exactly what it is. Now, certainly that's part of the brand, but I mean in the classic sense of a brand, where you could take a crazy word and through marketing make it seem something else. Well, we don't have that as new authors with no substantial marketing, but we need to be able to tell somebody exactly what something is as quickly as possible. And I think the math inspectors benefits from doing that. I don't know that that's a particularly clever name, right? No one will say, wow, how did you come up with that? It just sort of tells people exactly what it is. There says something to do with math, has something to do with inspectors. You can see a guy on there who looks like he's looking for clues. That gives that parent who is in the position of trying to find something for his reluctant reader and or kid at the beginning of their reader's journey a lot of clues as to, okay, I sort of know what that is. And I think there's a real lesson there, especially if you're targeting parents who are trying to buy for kids. Don't make it like every once in a while you'll come across a name for a movie and you have no idea what that movie's about. And I don't think that works really well in the online world. I think you benefit from telling people exactly what it is. So the math inspectors got lucky. I think people just started taking a chance on it. It started, really, our big push happened about 2 months in when it started showing up on the also bots of a semi-popular book in England. And it's in England where it really took off. And I would say for the next year, American sales lagged British sales every single month, which was weird because we thought, man, this is such a smaller market. It's so odd. But it's the power of landing on somebody's also bots, you know? And I don't know why we did. Maybe it's the cover. Maybe it's the name. I have no idea. Okay, so what else do we do? Again, Hank, I don't know. This is, I mean, I know that if you're going to give yourself the best chance to be successful writing kids and you're going to independently publish it and rely on online sellers, that you should probably target lower middle grade. I think you should definitely look at people who are having success and look at how they do their covers. It looks like bright colors do better than non-bright colors with that age group.
Sure.
You know, just spend time in Barnes & Noble and just look at the James Patterson books and the Wimpy Kid books and the Timmy Failure books and the Dork Diary books. And it doesn't take long before you think, okay, I get it. I understand what you're trying to tell me.
Right.
And then you just got to start taking shots, you know?
Well, adult fiction, I think most indie authors would readily admit that ebooks far outsell paper books, especially when you're talking genre fiction and things like that for indie authors.
Yes.
Is that the case for the YA and the middle grade, or do you guys sell a good many paperbacks?
So YA and middle grade shouldn't even be talked about in the same conversation. There's a gigantic wall that makes them very distinct and different. And I'm sure that in the YA world, ebooks far outsell print.
Before you go further, will you speak to that for just a minute? Like I think a lot of people, because we're ignorant, kind of lump those two together. What is the separator between YA and middle grade, and how do you distinguish between the two?
Right. So there is a separator in theory, and then there's like the separator in reality. And so if you go to Barnes & Noble, you see the separator in reality. They have a very clear section that is big, that's for kids, and middle grade is in that section. And YA is not in that section. They have a separate group for teens, and that's the YA section. And just by browsing the covers, you see that they're totally different. So middle grade will still rely on bright colors and stuff like that, even for adventures. And once you get into YA, now we're talking dark covers, earth tones, not bright contrast, just from a cover perspective. And then we go from a situation where in the middle grade area, you have lots of covers with boys on it, right? It's very unusual to have covers with girls on it, which is unfortunate. But again, we're talking about the cold, hard reality now, right?
Yeah.
And once you shift into YA, now it's a complete sea change. And you see that the preponderance of covers have girls on it. And again, I don't say that as any sort of a statement other than we're just in the real bookstore now. We're looking at what's really going on. But it's a little bit of a signpost to what's going on. And what it's telling readers is this is a book that's safe for girls. There's probably adventure, but there's almost certainly a hint of real romance here, you know? And that's not something you're going to find in middle grade. So the theoretical answer is it's all about the age of your main character. And the main characters of your YA novels are going to be in high school, and the main characters of your middle grade on down stories are going to be 12 and under. And it's when you get to the 13 and 14-year-old that most people in a writer's group will say, you just need to either make this person 12 or 16. Make a decision, you know? So, I mean, that's a little bit of what I would say. YA, more adult themes. There's probably some element of romance. And then there's this theoretical answer where you're trying to figure out not only who you are, your place in the world. And so for middle grade, maybe you're not quite I've never really counted to that as much, but I think you can get pretty close if you just look at main character, themes, romance,
and just
like
kind
that.
of the tone of the characters, I don't want to say childishness, but I guess that, you know, some of the way the character sees the world obviously is going to be from a, 12-year-old or, down kind of perspective.
For sure. Absolutely.
Oh, gotcha.
So that was the first thing we were addressing. And then, so that second part of what I was going to say is YA is going to be dominated by ebook sales for sure.
Okay.
And then middle grade on down is going to be dominated by print sales, even for us independent authors. So if you're an independent middle grade on down author who has awesome ebook sales, then it probably means that you have hit some sort of a crossover. So you have some sort of a fantasy that's crossed over to an adult market or something like that. So to give you an idea, I probably outsell 7-to-1 print to ebook sales.
Wow.
And
that's epic.
Right, and during Christmas time, it's just outrageous. It's probably 12 or 14-to-1. It's crazy because my book at that point then becomes a gift, and no one is thinking about ebooks at that point. And then for me, in January, my ebook sales will go up for a couple months, just that kind of post-Kindle boom. But then the rest of the year, they pretty well stink. And I would say especially since a year and a half or 2 years ago, whenever they made some substantial changes to Kindle Unlimited, smaller size books got destroyed in that carnage.
Right. Right.
Which, again, not a political statement. It's just the truth of what happened. So, yeah, that's where I'm at. Lots of print, not as many ebooks.
Well, that's I kind of figured that, and I didn't really. I guess I just based that on me and my kids. But so it was interesting to hear you say that. You said earlier that this age of reader discovers things through librarians, teachers, parents, and their friends at school. Is there anything that you can do as a writer to, especially as an indie publisher, connect with those librarians, teachers, those taste makers for people that age? Is that something that's a reality for an indie author?
I think it's a reality, especially for somebody who is better organized than myself, and who finds that kind of thing maybe a little bit easier. I have heard of some indie authors having really good success with author visits and connecting with librarians and connecting with schools. And then I've heard from some who have found it a waste of time. But I definitely have heard of some indie authors and know them through online groups and stuff who have done well with it. I'm not sure if it's like make a career off of that, but like a significant boost to their bottom line sort of a thing. But on the other hand, most people writing this genre are themselves either teachers or former teachers. And what you hear from a lot of them is, especially over the last 5 years, as more and more people are writing novels, that a lot of schools and librarians get inundated with requests to take my book, look at my book, look at this. And so they have just cautioned me that there's a right way and a wrong way to go about it. And I'm not exactly sure what exactly the right way is, but they generally say don't contact teachers directly, try to go through the proper channels. Like with big districts, sometimes there's even a clearinghouse person at the district level that's like a first stop. And then at the very least, it would be the librarian before teachers. If I had more time, if I didn't have to try to figure out babysitting and stuff like that, I would do more of that for sure. I think long term it's helpful. But right now, in my mind, I think, I'd rather just write another book.
Yeah. Well, sure. And I think both of those things are valid. It just depends on kind of what your goal is, I guess. My friend Stefan Boltz wrote a book called The Three Feathers, and he does school visits all the time.
Does he really?
And he says that he posts on Facebook all the time, that he gets a new case of books and he's taking them to this school to do a reading. And he said that's just the very best thing about writing, that it just, kind of, I don't know, it validates what he's doing, or, just the seeing that his story connects with a real kid, face to face is just, is an amazing thing. So,
it's cool. I've done them. Don't get me wrong. I love doing them.
Sure.
Everything he just said is right. And maybe at some point, now it's not my reality.
Right. And as being a dad with kids in school right now, I think if you have a relationship with your school district and your school beforehand, I think that would be a big help if you're trying to get in there. If somebody just cold calling elementary schools is probably going to look a little creepy.
No, totally. And again, I think they're getting a lot, right? There's so many more writers than ever before. So I just think there's a good way to do it and a bad way. I work a lot with my independent bookstore here in Omaha. Early on, I had some grand notions that I would listen to Dean Wesley Smith's advice, and I would totally be running my own publishing shop and getting my books. And then I looked at the reality of doing it, and I thought, man, this is not for me. Like, I know my weaknesses, and I will drown if I try to do this. So I just work with an awesome local independent bookstore here in Omaha called The Bookworm. They're the nicest human beings in the world. They love readers, but if possible, they love working with writers even more. And they're just great to work
that's
with.
great.
So, I mean, there's just a pleasure to have here in Omaha, Nebraska. And so I work with them, and they're very good about helping me do signings or events or stuff like that. And I'll do more school stuff in the future for sure.
Awesome. Dan, I've kept you almost an hour, and I feel like I could keep you for 3 more. There's just so much I want to talk to you about. But before we go, tell us about Dad Genius.
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. So Dad Genius is a book I wrote under the name Dan Kenney, just to keep it separate from my kids' books that are under Daniel Kenney. Obviously, that's not a huge separation, but at least lands them on different author pages. And I did that because there's lots of naughty words in Dad Genius. and because it has a cartoon cover and stuff, I didn't want some poor, unsuspecting adult to have to answer some very awkward questions after their kid read the first chapter. So This is a book that I've been sort of thinking about writing for a few years. So when I became a stay-at-home dad, I found myself doing, I think, what a lot of stay-at-home parents do on Facebook, which is, you're around kids all the time, and Facebook sometimes becomes a way to connect with adults. And I would find myself sharing this or that about my kids, and a lot of times people would think it was funny. And over the next couple of years, people would stop me and they would say, "Oh, I really like that post. That made me laugh." And then every once in a while, somebody would say, "Hey, that's the book you should write. I would really like to write that book." And by that, they meant some sort of a stay-at-home dad about my kid's book. I just didn't know the right way to approach it. I was like, how do I turn Facebook posts into a book? Well, about a year ago, I started using a Wacom tablet to draw cartoons because I knew I needed to teach myself a new skill to help some of the drawing I do for some of my books. Because for The Big Life of Remy Muldoon, there's about 175 pictures per book. And I've done 4 of those. And I just found myself, I'm like, man, this is really, it's so labor intensive for me. I need a faster way to do it. So I got the tablet so I could try to hopefully speed up everything. And to teach myself how to do it, I said, I'm going to learn how to do a daily cartoon. That was the way I was going to learn how to use the tablet. And the daily cartoon was a cartoon called Dad Genius. And it was about this stay-at-home dad named George McGill and his 5 kids and just the shenanigans that go on. So once I had 26 really good cartoons, I sent those out to the syndicates, the cartoon syndicates, knowing 100% that nobody would respond. But I just had to do it. It's just like, well, I'll do that.
Right.
And nobody...
We've had this conversation before.
Well, yeah. I mean, and nobody responded, and that's fine.
Right.
And then I said, well, I've got this good name. I've got these cartoons, and I've got these Facebook posts. And then I had a bunch of different stories that I'd been telling for years about marriage or my kids or just random stuff. And I thought, I finally think I know how to put this together in a book. So it's sort of a random collection of cartoons and Facebook posts. And then there's a through line. And the through line is sort of a memoir for how I came to be a stay-at-home dad. And then it sort of wraps up at the end as well. And what I will tell you is it's legitimately funny. And if anybody wants to feel, if you're a guy and you just want to feel better about your life, read this. It'll make you laugh, mostly at me. And then if you're a woman and you're listening to this podcast, get the book because it'll make you feel a lot better about who you're married to in comparison. So
I love it.
It's a funny book. What's hilarious about it is some publisher in Indonesia already wants the foreign rights to it. And I'm looking at my statement, I'm like, are they aware it's only sold like 37 copies? Like, why on earth? So I'm convinced that they have confused it with like Family Guy or something. Like somehow they think they're going to get this sweet deal on this awesome media property when it's this book that's sold less than a few dozen copies. So
that's awesome. Well, I just one-clicked it, and I'm going to start reading it on my Kindle tonight. So I love the premise, and I love what you're doing.
You get a guarantee. I apologize because it should make you laugh. The last thing I'll say,
I'm going to get into it for sure. Yeah.
The last thing I say is, I think as authors, we always got to adapt and figure out and try things. A couple things I'm doing this year is I'm trying to leverage the success that I've had with the math inspectors by launching a new series called the Science Inspectors. And that will start in about 5 weeks. And then I've got another series starting out that'll come out pretty soon called The History Mystery Kids, which is sort of my version of the Magic Treehouse books. And then finally, for years I've been trying to think, what in the adult world could I write that I'd feel good about writing? And I think I finally figured out what, because I really want a much more conventional way of trying to reach readers and build a mailing list. We didn't even talk about that. It's almost impossible to build a decent mailing list in the kids world. One, because there's laws about it. And number two, because it just doesn't work as well. And so I'm probably going to, at some point this year, I'm working on it right now, launch a series of cozy mysteries under a pen name, so I can start, adding that more, again, with kids, there's an element of just taking a lot of swings. And I think I want something where I have a little bit more certainty of where my next reader is coming from. So.
Yeah, great idea. Well, when you get farther along in that process, will you please come back on the show and talk to us about that?
Yeah, I'd love to, Hank. We'll do, okay?
Great. And thanks for coming on the show, Dan. Where can people find all of your work and kind of get plugged in to follow you and all that good stuff?
Sure. I think the best two places are to go to Amazon and search for Daniel Kenney, and that's Kenney. Number one, that way you can just very easily and quickly see all of my books. The other thing you can do is you can go onto Facebook and search for author Daniel Kenney, and that's a way you can catch me on Facebook.
All right. Well, thanks much for your time, Dan. All right. Well, thanks much for your time, Dan. And really appreciate it.
Thanks for what you do, okay?
It's called The Great Curse. The Great Curse can get inside your mind. Bad spirits come and whisper in the dark.
Stuff and evil people turned all wrong inside. So yeah, let's be superheroes, Joey. Let's make it right. You think we can? Somebody's got to. Let's do this, man. Let's fix things. Or die trying. Yeah. Or die trying.
click the link in the show notes to pick up the Jason Crane series by Richard Gleaves. You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, please subscribe to the show and leave a comment over on iTunes or Google Play. You can even subscribe at YouTube and Stitcher Radio. Thanks for listening.